So, what exactly happens when Catholics, or really any kind of Christian, uses arguments of atheists to critique another faith tradition? Well, I'll tell you what happens. One's arguments end up coming back to bite Christianity itself. And that's a problem. This is why Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, doesn't matter. One's arguments against another faith tradition should be consistent with one's own faith tradition. And if they're not, then they inevitably undermine Christianity. And that's a concern of mine. I think there's no problem with critiquing other faith traditions. I've done that plenty of times on this channel. I've critiqued Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, you name it. I have no problem with that, and I support criticisms of all faith traditions as long as they're constructive, honest, and consistent. But when they're not consistent and they function as undermining one's own faith tradition, it becomes hypocritical. And I'm especially concerned whenever I see arguments being used by Catholics that come back to bite Catholicism. That's a concern of mine. I think it needs to be addressed. And that's what I'm going to do today, respectfully analyzing some of the comments of Taylor Marshall on the PBD podcast. I would like to respectfully interact with what Taylor Marshall is saying here because I have some concerns that they come back to bite Catholicism and thus undermines Christianity as a whole, undermines the Bible, undermines the Catholic community, and could easily be called out by an atheist. So that's what I want to do today. But of course, I want to remind everybody, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you appreciate the content from this channel. So considering that we're going to have a respectful yet open and honest conversation about perhaps some inconsistencies here in what we're seeing from Taylor Marshall, let me go ahead and play a clip for you from Marshall on the PBD podcast. I don't think that I can go into a lot of detail in playing their clips. I don't know if I would get a copyright strike or anything like that. But so I'll play the relevant portion. You're, of course, welcome to go and watch the full thing yourself on the original channel. But let's take a look at what Taylor Marshall says here, specifically about the religion of Islam. Again, I have no problem with him critiquing Islam, as I've done here on this channel many times. My concern, however, is if he uses arguments against Islam that undermine Catholicism, Christianity, the Bible, that's when I think, I think this needs to be revised. I think this needs to be tweaked because I can certainly see a non-Christian, an atheist, coming back and pointing out some double standards and using that to undermine Christianity and Taylor Marshall's community. So let's go ahead and take a look at what Marshall is saying here. Okay, you should be able to see right around now. Let's go ahead and begin. All right.
We just talked about all these beautiful things about Christ and him coming and suffering and his humility and his passion, all these things. It's a beautiful story. It's very compelling. And then you see Muhammad as a warrior, and then he's, there's even the story if he once tried to commit suicide and he marries this, he's a polygamist and yet marries this girl. And I'm just thinking, I don't understand how you would think that this is the true religion.
Okay, so the concerns here, I guess, that Taylor Marshall has is that Muhammad was a warrior, a polygamist. What was the other thing? Suicidal at one point. These are the concerns. These are pretty popular arguments often used in discussions between apologists of all sorts, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants, and the Dawa guys, the Islamic apologists. These are common arguments and talking points that I tend to hear in the discussions between, again, Christian apologetics and Muslim apologetics. So, but again, the concern here that he's expressing is that Muhammad is a um, was suicidal at one point, polygamist, and a warrior. Now, in fairness to all the Muslims who are watching, look, I know, believe me, I understand. A lot of those things are contested by the Dawa guys and scholars and the Islamic tradition. I understand that. Let's just go ahead, however, and take everything that he says here at face value. Let's accept it. Let's say that all this is accurate, because he obviously maintains this is accurate, and so I want to use him by his own standards and see if it actually ends up undermining Christianity, which I think it does. So let's go ahead and take everything at face value that Muhammad was suicidal, polygamist, warrior, all that stuff. I have a very deeply serious concern that this undermines the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this will then impact every sort of Christian imaginable, especially Catholicism, which Taylor Marshall claims to be a Catholic. Now, I believe and understand there's a lot of concerns on whether or not Marshall is actually representing Catholicism accurately. Be that as it may, he identifies as a Catholic. So let's just go ahead and take him at that. Does this not, in fact, however, undermine Catholicism? That's my concern here, deep concern. Let me actually share my screen and let's take a look at a few passages. He speaks of a warrior here as if there's something inherently negative about that. Let's take a look at Moses in the Old Testament from Numbers 31, among many other places. Let's take a look at this with the slaughter of the Midianites. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the sons of Israel. Afterward you will be gathered to your people." So Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Arm men from among you for the war, so that they may go against Midian, to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall send 1,000 from each tribe of all tribes of Israel to the war." So there were selected from thousands of Israel 1,000 from each tribe, 12,000 armed for war, and Moses sent them 1,000 from each tribe, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, to the war with them, and the holy implements and the trumpets for the alarm in his hand. So they made war against Midian, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses, and they killed every male. They killed the kings of Midian, along with the rest of those killed. They also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword, and the sons of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones. So the children were taken captive, and they plundered all their cattle, all the flock, and all their property. Then they burned all their cities where they lived and all their encampments. And they took all the plunder and all the spoils, both of people and of livestock. They brought the captives and the spoils and the plunder of Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the congregation of the sons of Israel, to the camp at the plains of Moab, which are by the Jordan, opposite Jericho. And Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the congregation went out to meet them outside the camp. But Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, who had come from service in the war. And Moses said to them, "Have you spared all the women? Behold, they caused the sons of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to be unfaithful to the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the plague took place among the congregation of Yahweh. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones." So kill all the little children. "Kill every woman who has known a man intimately. However, all the girls," and the term here used in Hebrew is children among the women. So these are children, girls. "All the female children, girls who have not known a man intimately, who have not engaged in sex, keep alive for yourselves." Now, it's a little unclear. Were these little girls kept alive for marriage with the Israelites, either at this time or at a later time? Unclear. However, the little girls are kept alive, but the little boys are to be killed. The women are to be killed. All the men are to be killed. The cattle killed. Plunder the cities, everything. Okay. Now, this is not unique in the Bible. We see this with the conquest of Canaan, with Joshua. Some people attempt to recast this as, well, perhaps it's not literal, perhaps it's not historic, perhaps it's X, Y, and Z. However, there are other instances that can be pointed to where there clearly are wars and killings in the Old Testament. So if the concern is that one is a warrior, what about Moses? What about Joshua? What about Abraham? That's a concern of mine. And I think that it's inconsistent because it comes back to bite the Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. And I say the New Testament because Jesus in the New Testament praised Moses. Jesus upheld what Moses did and taught. Jesus even says the law of Moses is something that he upholds and fulfills. Matthew 5:17, 18. Do not think I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus praised Moses often, and he called people out for citing Moses who were hypocritical in their citations of Moses. So he affirmed him. As he affirmed King David, who was a warrior, as he affirmed Joshua, as he affirmed everyone else in the Old Testament who were warriors. And by the way, in the New Testament, Jesus is a warrior because in the book of Revelation, he comes back and slaughters all of his enemies, and there's incredibly graphic descriptions of how he's going to squash his enemies like someone who squashes grapes. And as you get your garments covered in grapes when you're squashing grapes, the blood of his enemies will be stained all over his garments. Jesus is a warrior in the New Testament. So I think this should be kept in mind. Of course, you also have cases like David in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 18. There's an entire song made about David. Saul has struck down his 10,000s and David, or his thousands, and David his 10,000s. David was a warrior. Why did God not allow David to build the temple? Why did that go to his son Solomon? Because the Bible says that David had shed too much blood to build the temple for God. Take a look at this from the book of Judges with Samson. Samson arrived at Lehi. The Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, so that the ropes that bound him were like flax that had been burned by fire, and his bonds dissolved. He happened upon a jawbone from a putrefying donkey, reached out to grab it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson declared, with a jawbone from the donkey, here a heap, there a pair of heaps. With the jawbone of the donkey, I've killed 1,000 men. I doubt very seriously it was an actual literal 1,000. I think obviously it's just being rhetorical, saying it's a lot of people. Nonetheless, he was a warrior. He died killing people. You remember that? The columns, pushed the columns, broke them, killed everyone inside, including himself. He was a warrior. And the Bible praises him. It doesn't condemn Samson. It praises him. What about the book of Hebrews, where it praises Samson? In Hebrews 11:32 speaks of him as a man of great faith. But not only that, it mentions David, who's also a warrior. But watch this, Jephthah. You know who Jephthah is? The author of Hebrews, some think is Paul, says that Jephthah was a warrior, but was commended and a man of great faith, because the context of Hebrews 11 is to praise people of great faith. But who was Jephthah? Jephthah was the man who killed his daughter in a vow to Yahweh. And he's praised for that in the Bible. He made a rash vow saying, if you give me this victory, whatever's the first thing that comes out of my house, I will sacrifice to Yahweh. He thought maybe an animal would come out. Turns out it was his daughter who came out. And he didn't say, it's better to not kill my daughter. and for me to just break my vow. No, he said, I have to keep my vow. And he killed his daughter. And the Bible doesn't condemn him for that. The Bible praises him and celebrates him as a man of great faith. He was a warrior, and the Bible praised him for it. Talking about being suicidal, I've also found this to be interesting. Because, of course, there's this famous passage from 1 Kings 19 that describes Elijah as hoping to die. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life when he came to Beersheba in Judah. He left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And then, of course, an angel gives him some food, and he feels better, which I think we can all relate to whenever we're feeling sad and down and depressed. Get some food, get some sleep. You'll probably feel better. And he felt better, right? But notice this. He prayed that he might die. That's how frustrated he was with his situation. That's how confused he was. Clearly, that was not the right choice. And yet this is a prophet of God who's praised not only in the Old Testament, but the New Testament. And this is, in fact, one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah. Now, he also mentioned polygamy, which I continue to just find to be an odd thing to complain about. Now, to be clear, from the Catholic perspective, polygamy is always immoral, both in the Old Testament and New Testament. By way of the natural law, sacramental marriage, it's always immoral and it's not the ideal that God established. Now, some Protestants and maybe even some Eastern Orthodox might hold to some more nuanced views and wouldn't necessarily say it's always immoral. But from the Catholic perspective, it's always immoral. So when the prophets engaged in this behavior, from the Catholic perspective, that was wrong. But here's the thing. If Taylor Marshall gives a pass to the Old Testament patriarchs and their polygamy and doesn't discredit the Old Testament and its religion, but he does discredit Muhammad and his religion for his polygamy, then there's an inconsistency. And an atheist can easily point that out. There's a Genesis 16, it says, now Sarai, this is before her name was changed to Sarah, Abram, before his name was changed to Abraham. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had kept an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. So it wasn't fornication, it was polygamy. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And these weren't his only two wives. He had others. The Bible describes the other wives of Abraham. It wasn't just Abraham. It was also Solomon. It was also David. These were great men of faith. Abraham, Solomon, Moses. They're praised in the Bible. Some of their faults are also confessed, David and Solomon in particular, and even Abraham. But they're seen as men of great faith, and they're never indicted for the polygamy aspect. So my concern, again, at the end of the day, is perhaps the dishonesty and hypocrisy I've already seen in the comment section as I'm doing this video. People complaining about the fact that I'm pointing out this in the Bible. Because I guess they have a desire to use these arguments in their apologetics efforts towards Islam and others. Okay, I understand the need to criticize. I totally get that. But I think one becomes dishonest when they insist on using arguments that come back to bite Christianity just because they want to get at someone else. I think that's when it's dishonest. Because it would be like an adulterer criticizing another adulterer for adultery, and somebody comes along and says, "But wait, hold on, I thought you're an adulterer too." I don't want to hear that. How dare you bring up that I'm an adulterer? Wait, hold on. Wait. I thought Christianity is to follow the truth. I thought Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. I thought that one should be truthful in what they say if one wants to follow he who is the truth, right? So I'm concerned when I see dishonest people in the comment section already saying, wait, no, it's wrong to bring this up. What are you trying to do? Defend Islam? What I'm trying to do here is to show that an atheist could use these same arguments to critique Christianity. And so I think that's a problem. Feel free to critique Islam, but use arguments that don't come back to bite you. That's all I'm saying. And that was very clear. And I made that clear at the beginning and even now at the end. And I'm sure people will still ignore what I'm saying here. And that speaks to dishonesty, hypocrisy, and evil. And I can promise you this, nobody will be impressed by this line of approach and these hypocritical arguments. Nobody will convert to Christianity and think it's somehow amazing when they see the employment of hypocritical arguments. That's not what will win souls. At best, one will win somebody to their apologetics community, but not to Christianity. That's my concern. So I want to be consistent in what I say. If I critique Taylor Marshall, I want to make sure I'm not making that same mistake. If I critique anyone or anything or any group, I want to make sure it doesn't come back to bite me, because if it does, we have a problem. If someone were to critique the Old Testament with an argument that comes back to bite them in the New Testament, there's an issue. This semi-Marcionite position that we just saw from Taylor Marshall is troubling, because it's just that. It's a Marcionite position. Not the first time we've seen this neo-Marcionism from Taylor Marshall. Marcion, who pitted the Old Testament against the New Testament and saw them as two different gods. You cannot critique polygamy and those other things that are found in the prophets and the patriarchs, being a warrior and all of that. You cannot critique that as a Christian, because as a Christian, you have to hold to the Old Testament. You don't have to say that everything is applicable for today, but the moral standards of the Old Testament are no different than the moral standards in the New Covenant. They might be fulfilled, they might be enhanced, but they're certainly not negated. And the same God that inspired the Old Testament and approved of those moral actions and called for them in some cases is the same God of the New Testament, right? Dan, thank you for the super sticker. He says, thank you, Michael, for calling out Taylor. Mr. Marshall doesn't speak for all Catholics, as many people think that he does. And my intention is not to make this so much about Marshall as it is. I think what Marshall is doing here is indicative of what I see as a whole in the apologetics community. It's a problem. It's an issue, and I don't think it's a testimony to the standards that the Bible is calling for. The Bible calls for standards of honesty and consistency and an avoidance of hypocrisy. So if your argument against anyone or any group is so necessary, even though it comes back to bite you, it's so necessary for you to use that argument, your heart's in the wrong place, because you're being deceptive in using arguments against someone else that could be used against you. At that point, it's clear you're not concerned about the pursuit of truth. You're concerned about something else, not the pursuit of truth, however. And when you are not concerned about the pursuit of truth, Might I submit to you, the New Testament is saying you're not actually following God? Because again, it describes God as the way, the truth, the life, right? Okay. So live to that standard. Matthew says critique of polygamy is important, but not surface level nonsense like Marshall. You know, you can find Aquinas and stuff like that, where you can find some critiques of polygamy in comparison to the New Covenant. But I think what you heard from Marshall there would indict God in the Old Testament. That's the problem. One can argue that polygamy is not the ideal and is not applicable in the New Covenant. There's different perspectives here among different Christian communities, obviously. But one can certainly make those cases, not stopping that. But if somehow polygamy in and of itself is a fault, as he indicated there, well, I think he just indicted the patriarchs of the Old Testament, which again is a manifestation of neo-Marcionism. Nero says, Michael, when Muslims point to the Old Testament, are they ignoring it in light of the New Testament? I'm not sure if I think I might be following you. Of course, there's different views among Muslims, and I think you might be saying that they're just attempting to critique something in the Old Testament without looking at the New Testament, which might be indicative and true of some Muslims. I think that might be true, yeah. Okay. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything else in the chat. Connor says, Taylor Marshall sadly has some really bad arguments. Even when I was a radical traditionalist, they weren't super convincing. I'll tell you this. As a broad rule, not always true, as a broad rule, the more shallow the arguments, the more, however, bombastic, but poorly thought out the arguments, the more attention one will get and the more popular they will be. The one who employs consistent arguments, more sophisticated arguments in a less bombastic way will probably have lesser of a following. That's just a general rule across all faith communities online, on social media. Rutger says that Taylor Marshall is a Protestant. I wonder why he joined the church. I think what you mean by that is that a lot of his perspectives are still more consistent with Protestantism than they are Catholicism. That's true, but perhaps that's a show for another day. Matthew says Taylor is an enemy of the church. A lot of people see him as very problematic for Catholicism and not at all representative of the Catholic position. But he has a great deal of visibility, and he was, as I just showed, on the PBD podcast representing Catholicism. And so whether or not he does represent, technically speaking, Catholicism or not, visibly speaking and in the eyes of most people, they would think that he's a proper representative of Catholicism. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for this show. Got some more coming your way, so stay tuned. Make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and also check me out at patreon.com if you want to support the channel. By the way, I want to show you one other thing here that I have coming up. So let me share my screen, make you aware of it. If you go to rtcourses.com, R is in reason, T is in theology, courses.com, go over here to Know Salvation Outside the Church, a careful look at the Catholic position. And I am going to have an online, actually 2 lectures that I'm going to do online. And this is going to be on August. Let me pull it up here. August 16th at 12 p.m. Central. 2 lectures, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. And if you can't attend live, that's fine, because once you purchase the course, you'll just always have it. So whether you attend live or not, you'll have access to it. So go here, purchase the course, check it out, and let's get ready for that. That's going to be August 16th at 12 p.m. Central, rtcourses.com. I hope y'all are excited about it, because we're going to have a very careful look at this doctrine in the last 2,000 years. All right, so that's going to do it for today. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. God bless.